Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Well, after all these incredibly passionate and moving speeches, I think my role tonight is to be the light relief. Apropos of which, I'd like to say something about virgins. The most recent scholarship on the subject of the 72 virgins suggests that it may be a mistranslation, and that the word virgins should actually be the word raisins. and if there is a reason for believing in an afterlife, it's because you want to see the expressions on the faces of people showing up expecting 72 virgins, and he handed a bowl of raisins. These are satisfactions we may just have to imagine. I want to, of course, thank the American Jewish Congress. It's a fantastic thing that you've organized here, and it's really, I mean, apart from anything else, it's wonderful for me personally to be amongst these other honorees, these people of such brilliance and distinction and courage. So it's wonderful to have that opportunity. Thank you. And also just to have a forum such as this in which we can talk to each other. You know, it seems as if the forums in which the world can speak to other parts of itself are dwindling, and it's wonderful to see people making an effort to create such rooms. I was very struck when we were discussing earlier about how many Jewish organizations there are. It reminded me about a thing that people used to say in India, in Bengal, for instance, which is a highly politicized area. People say if you have two Bengalis in a room, you have a political party. If you have three Bengalis in a room, you have two political parties, both of them left-wing. So in that sense, I feel a kind of kinship with organizations such as this. And I just wanted to say, because I guess of my background as being by academic training a historian, and then by professional inclination an inventor of stories, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what seems to me at the root of some of these the problems in the Muslim world, which have to do with problems, in fact, of philosophy and intellect and education. And you know, myself, I'm not particularly religious, I have to say. I think one of the gifts I feel that my parents gave me is that they weren't very religious themselves. And at the time, that didn't seem unusual. At the time, growing up in India, it didn't seem like a very big deal that I wasn't having Islam or anything else forced down my throat. In fact, I grew up in a neighborhood in which my friends were members of every conceivable religion. You know, and our reaction to this was simply to have each other's holidays, because that meant we had more holidays. That seemed like the smart move. And somehow the effect of living in a world or a neighborhood surrounded not only by Muslim children but Hindus, Sikhs, Christians, Jewish children, you know, European children, American children, children from every part of India, is that kind of Catholic environment was in a curious way very secularizing. It meant that none of it was that central in any of our lives. And I've always thought that was the good fortune of my generation. I mean, now you have a generation in which these camps are more embattled. And it's harder to have this easygoing relationship, this easygoing interaction, which doesn't feel like it matters very much, which seems to me to be the most natural way. I mean, as I say, I've never therefore had much in the way of religion, but one of the people I've always thought of as a great model was my maternal grandfather, who was a Kashmiri Muslim, a Western-trained doctor, but an extremely devout Muslim. I mean, somebody who said his prayers 5 times a day all his life, who performed the pilgrimage to Mecca and so on, and yet, in my knowledge of him, was just about the most open-minded and tolerant man that I ever knew. And when I think about models of open-mindedness and tolerance, I think first about him. Even though, as I say, he was in many ways temperamentally the opposite to myself, in that he was deeply, deeply devout. But that didn't mean that he wasn't able to have a good conversation about it. You know, I mean, I can remember at the age of about 13 telling him that I wasn't sure that I believed in God. And he said, "Oh, well, sit down here and tell me how you got hold of such a damn fool idea as that." But it was like there were not forbidden subjects. There were not no-go areas. You could talk about anything and he would treat you with respect, even if you were only 13 and full of all kinds of stupidities. I mean, my own father was really, I think, if that's possible, even less religious than me. But he was enormously interested in Islam as a scholar of it, and he knew an enormous amount about it. And I think maybe I know that a lot of my interest in the subject, of the subject of Islam, came from his interest in it. For instance, I remember being told by him when I was very young that it is quite clear that the Quran is in a mess, textually. You know, if you read the chapters, they suddenly change subject. And the subject is resumed 30 chapters later. So it's quite clear that somewhere in the compilation of the Quran, there were mistakes. And that it became one of his, as a kind of amateur scholar of the subject, it became a kind of never realized dream of his to clean up the mess. You know, to kind of re-edit the Quran and put it back into a sense put it back into a shape in which the chapters made sense. Well, I guess it was probably quite a good idea that he didn't do that. But I guess he infected me with some kind of desire to mess around with the subject. So it's his fault. Although I have to say, I think he would have completely understood what I tried to do in what people in the Muslim world call that book. It's very odd when you've written 13 or 14 books, when people say, "Oh, I read that book of yours," and you always know which one they mean. You know? I had one just actually the other day. I was in a restaurant in New York where there was an Egyptian maitre d', and he came up to me and he said, Rushdie, I read that book." I said, "Yeah," and he said, "I like it, Rushdie, I like that book. In Egypt," he said, "it's totally bad." I said, "Yeah, I heard that's totally bad." He said, "But everyone has read it." So I thought that was a compliment. Anyway, the point about studying Islam at university at Cambridge, which I did, is that it struck me that there is something unique about Islam which none of the other great world religions can claim, which is that it's an event inside recorded history. That's to say, to a much greater extent even than Christianity, where the Gospels come much later than the actual life of Christ. Islam is something which happened at a time when history was very established. You know what was happening. You know the politics of the period, you know the social conditions, you know the economics of the period, and you can study Islam in the way that you cannot study any other religion, as an event inside history, as an event shaped by, created by, and responding to the history of its time. And it strikes me as one of the great tragedies and one of the kind of root causes of the problem inside Islam, that you can't have that conversation inside Islam. Whereas in fact, anyone who has studied it even in the most trivial way can tell you some very fascinating things. For instance, that Muhammad, after all, became a prophet rather late in his life. He was a very successful businessman. He went on these caravan trips, trading, and met the kind of Christians he met were a particular local desert variation of Christianity called Nestorian Christianity. And the Bible stories that you find in the Quran are exactly the variations of the Nestorian Christians. For instance, in the Quran, Jesus Christ is in a chapter called Maryam, by the way, Mary. Jesus Christ is born in an oasis under a palm tree. And many of the other stories that the Bible, the Old Testament and New Testament stories that you find in the Quran are these desert variations. And yet, although it's quite clear to anybody who looks at this for 5 minutes how Muhammad got hold of these stories, if you have to believe in the Quran as the uncreated word of God, you can't have this conversation. It's quite clear that one of the great driving forces of the birth of Islam is that Arabia in the 7th century was metamorphosing from a nomadic society, which was matriarchal in its inheritance laws and its social structures, into an urbanized society with settled communities, which was changing into a patriarchal society. And as a result, you find a culture in which family groups had been very extended, changing into nuclear families, and therefore large numbers of people being excluded and disenfranchised, who had previously been inside the tent, so to speak, now being out in the streets. And if you look at Muhammad himself being an orphan, and not therefore included underneath the patronage of any of these great families, found himself espousing a philosophy which harked back to the more caring, more inclusive culture of nomadic Arabia. Makkah at the time of Muhammad was only a third-generation city. It's a very, very new place. And you can see the entire philosophy of the Quran being in a way, a backward-looking, conservative plea for the values of nomadic culture, which becomes a revolutionary and radical plea because the people it appeals to are the people disenfranchised by urbanization. In other words, the street mob. And so it becomes a revolutionary philosophy. Now, all of this is available. You can look at it and you can see it in by textual analysis of the book. But in Muslim countries, you can't have this conversation because you have to see this as being the uncreated word of God. And God, of course, is not interested in the socioeconomic conditions of Arabia in the 7th century. Maybe he should have been, but apparently wasn't. There have been attempts to break down this anathema which prevents real scholarship and therefore real understanding from taking place. For instance, my name is Rushdie because my father, who adopted it as a family name, was an admirer of the 12th century Muslim thinker Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, and who was a great scholar of Aristotle and so on. One of the things that he tried to argue against the literalists, he tried to argue from Quranic sources that in favor of interpretation rather than literal acceptance. And one of the most persuasive arguments, or one of the ones I've liked most anyway, is in the Quran, the idea of the relationship between God and man is very different in certain ways than it is either in Judaism or Christianity. The Judeo-Christian idea is that God created man in his own image. Therefore, there must be some relationship between God and man structurally. Islam, the Quran says that God has no human qualities, that it would be, if you like, belittling God to say that God was in any way like mere mortals. Ibn Rushd used this as an argument to say, well, if God has no human qualities, well, language is a human quality. So it would be belittling God to assume that God spoke Arabic. Because God, whatever God does, he doesn't speak human languages. And when God communicates with us, we interpret that into human languages, and therefore the writing down in the Quran itself is an act of interpretation of something which in its nature is non-lingual. And he used that to say, well, if the beginning is an interpretation, you can go on interpreting. You don't have to atrophy at the moment of the revelation. That was a great intellectual battle fought in Islam in the 12th century, and unfortunately the progressive view did not succeed. The literalist view is the one that triumphed and has become more and more powerful ever since. It seems to me that there is something here which is really the root of the issue. If you cannot reinterpret your culture from first principles upwards, then in a way you live in an intellectual tyranny. And that becomes the problem from which all other problems follow. When I was at university, I stumbled over this incident, which I didn't make up, the so-called incident of the Satanic Verses, in which, I mean, again, the history is imprecise, but it seems as if, and various historians have suggested, that it seems as if the Prophet in the early period of Islam was offered a deal. In Makkah at the time, there were three very, very powerful pagan goddesses, Lat, Manat, Uzza. Their temples stood at the gates of the city, at the beginnings of the big caravan trails. And whenever anybody came or went, and Makkah, of course, a great mercantile capital, whenever anybody came or went from the city, they would make offerings at these temples, or to put it in another way, pay taxes. And as a result, the great families who controlled these temples controlled the wealth of the city through these temples. And it made them extremely rich, because they taxed the entire mercantile activity of the city. So it seems as if what may have been proposed to Muhammad was that if he could just accept these three goddesses, but winged creatures, winged goddesses, as being semi-divine. I mean, he was not even asked to put them at the same level as Allah himself. But as it was pointed out, you already have angels. You know, you've already got Jibreel, the angel of the revelation, and so on. 3 more angels is all we need. And at that point, you know, everything will be cool, and we don't have to persecute you, and etc. So Muhammad goes up the mountain in this interpretation and comes down with these verses which say, have you heard of Al-Lat and Al-Manat and Al-Uzza, the third, the other one? These are the exalted birds, and their intercession is greatly to be desired. Right? Well, uproar, etc. We don't exactly know what happened. We don't know what happened in terms of the reactions of the faithful. We don't know whether he was betrayed and they didn't give him the deal that they were promising him. We don't know how long all this took. What we do know is that at a certain later point, which could have been a week later, or it could have been a month later, or several months later, he went back up the mountain, came down, and told the faithful that on the previous occasion the devil had appeared to him in the guise of the archangel, and that what he had received were therefore not God's verses but satanic verses, which were the devil's verses and should be expelled from the Quran. And he gave instead of those verses new verses, which are now found in the Quran in the chapter called Al-Najm, the star. And the new verses say, have you heard of Al-Lat, Al-Banat, Al-Uzza, the third, the other one? These are but names that your forefathers invented, and there is no truth in them. Shall God have daughters while you have sons? That would be an unjust division. Now, it seemed to me that a verse which states that the reason why these creatures cannot be divine is that they are female might give us some clues about this new idea's attitudes towards women. And that it might at the very least be worth having a look at. You know, if you want to see how an idea develops, you may as well look and see how it starts. But again, and I think the problem was, for many of the people who took against the book, that in order to be able to think in this way, you have to be able to go and ask the questions from first principles. You have to not take anything as given. You have to accept that everything can be put into question. And if you live in a culture in which you are told that certain things are beyond question, which cannot be questioned, which must not be questioned, it's wrong to question them, then you live in a culture which tries to kill people who question those things. And it has seemed to me that if what happened to my work was representative of anything, it was representative of that. It was representative of the problem of living in a culture which would not ask itself difficult questions, which would not ask itself the difficult questions about itself, and would not question itself, perhaps in order to come up with new answers. which is the nature of all philosophical inquiry in all cultures at all times. And if that doesn't happen in Islam, it's a deep problem. Now, the other thing to say is that the Islam that now exists and that we all read about in the newspapers and so on is a relatively recent, in my view, deformation of Islam. And that the Islam that I grew up with, certainly in India and Pakistan, I mean, believe me, Pakistan was not what it now is. Pakistan was a country with very little interest in religion for a country that had been founded on the back of a religion. And that on those occasions in Pakistan when elections took place, not very frequent occasions, but on those occasions when elections did take place, religious parties such as the Jamaat-e-Islami would get 1 or 2% of the vote. Nobody really wanted religious politics in Pakistan until maybe 10 or 12 years ago. It's a relatively new development. Indian Islam was always highly secularized, in the sense that in India, you know, Islam is a minority. I mean, it's a very big minority. There's perhaps 130 million Muslims out of 1 billion people. It's a lot of people, but it's a minority. And one of the ideas that was of which Indian Muslims were persuaded by the great generation of independence nationalist leaders, Gandhi, Nehru, etc., was that their own interests were best safeguarded by secularizing the state. In other words, because if the state were not secular, it would be a Hindu state, and that would clearly militate against them. Therefore, Indian Muslims always accepted secularism as a basic principle of how you organize a country. And it's interesting to me that even now, even at this very explosive moment in the history of Islam, Indian Islam has still more or less entirely resisted the temptations of radical extremism, in spite of the fact that radical extremism has been very active in the northern state of Kashmir, much of that pushed over the border from Pakistan. It hasn't taken that deep root, in spite of the fact that even in recent months that there are clearly attempts by shadowy forces to destabilize Hindu-Muslim relations by having explosions go off in a Muslim mosque one day or in a Hindu area the other day, whether it's in Bombay or South India, both of which have happened in the last 3 or 4 months. In spite of that, the reaction has not been the kind of knee-jerk outrage and violence that we often now have come to associate with Muslim reactions. That has not been happening. So something has happened in India which I think the world might just have a little look at. That there is a situation there where a very, very large Muslim population has understood the importance of a secular democratic political structure and has lived inside that now for getting on for 60 years. And as a result, India is really the only country in the region which has managed to sustain a free society for six decades. And if you just look at the countries around India, you can see how much better off the people of India have been than Pakistan or Burma or China, so on. So there is a clue there, I think, that if you, and this is what comes back to the point about the intellectual area, because this is about education. This is about how you tell people what the shape of their life can be and should be and might be, and how you encourage them to think about it. And I do think that one of the great problems right now in India, in the Muslim majority countries, and in the West, comes down to the subject of education. We know that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were born in the madrasas that existed on the Pakistan-Afghan frontier. We know that those madrasas were financed from outside. And we know that although they didn't directly preach terrorism, they preached a worldview of such a polarized worldview that it was very easy when people imbibed that worldview to take the next step, and the next step was terrorism. We have in India today extreme religious seminaries which are dreadfully damaging the conditions of Indian Muslims. For instance, recently there was a court case in which a woman had been raped by her father-in-law. And this seminary, the seminary called Darul Uloom in a town called Deoband, which is the heart place of a variation of Islam called Deobandi Islam, which is the kind of Indian version of Wahhabism. The Deobandi mullahs announced that since this woman had been raped by her father-in-law, she was now unclean to her husband, and therefore he should divorce her. There's no suggestion that she was in any way complicit in this act of sexual violence, and yet she was the one who was supposed to suffer for it. Such things are happening even in India all the time. The difference in India is that there's also a kind of outcry against them. They are not accepted immediately as orthodoxy and correctness. There is quite a large outcry, and in fact in that particular case I think the outcry meant that such things may not emanate from Deoband again very soon. But the fact is that children are being brought up in religious schools to believe in a picture of the world from which violence easily follows. And that is a problem not just in India, and not just, it's a problem, I mean, I see it happening in England. You know? I mean, I think one of the things for which the Blair government will be remembered with most contempt is its decision to begin to fund Islamic schools. A few weeks ago, one such Islamic school was raided by the police and was believed to be the center of a bomb factory. But it's getting government support. And this is, I mean, many of the other speakers have alluded to this, the great mistake of dealing with the wrong people, of believing that these voices, which may not be terrorists, but which actually are so ultra-conservative and repressive that they are the fellow travelers of terrorism, in my view, and beginning to see those voices as being the authentic voices of Islam, whereas all the modernizing voices are sort of dismissed as being westernized and marginal. You know, that is a great historical mistake. And as I say, that's not just a mistake being made in the East, but it's being made in the West as well.